Disowned by my family, I found support in unexpected places. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who cut deepest. Sometimes the family that raised you becomes the enemy you never saw coming. And sometimes, when you lose everything you thought mattered, you discover what actually does. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. If you've ever been the one they counted out, the one they thought would never amount to anything. Because this story is for every woman who's ever had to prove her worth to people who should have seen it from the beginning. My name is Marlena Chen. I am 32 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. Though for the longest time I wasn't sure I belonged anywhere at all. I spent most of my life believing that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, and that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be the disappointing daughter, the one who never quite measured up. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was especially wrong about who my real family was. Growing up as the middle child in the Chen household meant existing in a perpetual state of invisibility. My older brother Marcus was the golden child, valedictorian, full scholarship to Stanford, then Harvard Law, now a partner at one of Seattle's most prestigious firms. My younger sister Vivian was the princess, beautiful, charming, married to a tech executive at 24 with a picture-perfect life that looked like it had been curated for Instagram. And then there was me, Marlena, the one who chose art over economics, who opened a small pottery studio instead of pursuing a real career, who remained stubbornly single while my parents dropped increasingly unsubtle hints about grandchildren and family legacy. Marlena's going through a phase, my mother would tell her friends, as if my entire adult life was some temporary rebellion I'd eventually outgrow. She'll settle down eventually. But I wasn't going through a phase. I was building something beautiful, something mine. My studio, Earthbound Ceramics, had been slowly growing for 6 years. I had a small but dedicated clientele. I taught weekend workshops. And I was finally starting to make a real living doing what I loved. Not the kind of money that impressed my parents, but enough to pay rent on my little apartment above the studio and to feel proud of what I'd created. The irony is that I kept trying to make them proud anyway. Every family dinner, every holiday, gathering, every phone call felt like an audition I was failing. My mother would ask about my little pottery hobby, in the same tone she might ask about a rash that was taking too long to clear up. My father would nod politely when I talked about my work, then immediately pivot to asking Marcus about his latest case or congratulating Vivian on her husband's promotion. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was different, that I didn't need their approval, that I'd chosen my own path and I was happy with it. But the truth was, their indifference carved hollows in me that I kept trying to fill with their acceptance. Everything changed on a Thursday in March. I was in my studio, working on a series of large planters for a local restaurant, when my phone rang. It was my mother, which was unusual. She typically preferred texting, brief, efficient messages that felt more like updates from a distant acquaintance than communication from someone who'd given birth to me. "Marlena, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Can you come by the house this evening?" There was something in her tone, a formality that made my stomach clench. "Is everything okay? Is Dad, your father is fine. We're both fine. But there's something we need to discuss as a family. A family meeting. In 32 years, we'd never had a family meeting that wasn't about dividing up chores or planning a vacation. This felt ominous in a way I couldn't articulate. I arrived at my childhood home just as the sun was setting, painting the familiar craftsman-style house in warm golden light. It should have felt welcoming, but instead it felt like walking into a courtroom where I was about to be sentenced for a crime I didn't know I'd committed. Marcus was already there, sitting in Dad's leather chair like he owned the place. Vivian, perched on the edge of the sofa, her perfect blowout catching the lamplight, her manicured hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a portrait. They both looked up when I walked in, and I caught something in their eyes. Pity, maybe, or guilt. Marlena, sit down, my mother said, gesturing to the remaining chair. She and my father sat on the love seat across from us, their faces wearing matching expressions of what I can only describe as business-like compassion. We've been doing a lot of thinking lately, my father began, his hands clasped in front of him. About the family, about our future, about legacy. Legacy. The word that had haunted my entire childhood. The invisible measuring stick I'd never been tall enough to reach. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, he continued. We've been reviewing our estate plans, making sure everything is in order for when we're gone. I felt my chest tighten. I'd never thought much about inheritance. My parents weren't wealthy by any stretch, just comfortable middle-class folks who'd saved diligently and invested wisely. But sitting there, watching the careful way they were constructing their sentences, I began to understand that this wasn't just about money. We've decided to leave everything to Marcus and Vivian, my mother said, her voice gentle but firm. The house, the investments, the life insurance policies, all of it. The words hung in the air like smoke. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where she explained why they were telling me this, the part where they outlined my portion, or explained some special arrangement they'd made. But that was it. That was the whole sentence. I don't understand, I said finally, though I was beginning to understand all too well. Marlena, honey. My mother leaned forward, her tone taking on that patronizing sweetness she used when she was about to say something particularly hurtful. You've made your choices. You've chosen your art over stability, your independence over family. You've made it clear that our values don't align with yours. Marcus and Vivian have built real lives, my father added. They have careers, families, futures that honor what we've tried to build. They understand responsibility. I looked at my siblings, waiting for one of them to object, to defend me, to point out the absurdity of what our parents were saying. But Marcus was studying his hands, and Vivian was looking out the window like she'd rather be anywhere else. This isn't about punishment, my mother continued. It's about practical reality. Marcus and Vivian have children to think about, mortgages, college funds. They can use this inheritance to build something lasting. But you? She trailed off, shaking her head. You'd probably just spend it on more pottery supplies. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. 6 years of building a business, of creating something from nothing, of working 16-hour days to turn my passion into a sustainable career. And she saw it as playing with pottery supplies. I've been supporting myself for over a decade, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I own my business, I pay my bills, I contribute to society. How is that not building something lasting? It's a hobby, Marlena, my father said, with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. A very expensive hobby that we've indulged long enough. And besides, Marcus spoke for the first time, his lawyer voice coming out. It's not like you need the money. You've always said you don't care about material things, that you're happier living simply. This way, the inheritance goes to people who can actually use it to build generational wealth. I turned to stare at my brother, this man who'd shared a childhood with me, who'd once helped me build blanket forts and taught me how to ride a bike. You're okay with this? He shrugged, not quite meeting my eyes. It makes sense, Marlena. You've always been the rebel, the one who didn't want to follow the family path. This is just following that logic to its natural conclusion. Vivian? I looked at my sister, hoping for some sign of solidarity, some acknowledgement that this was wrong. Vivian finally looked at me, and her expression was a mixture of sympathy and something that looked almost like relief. I'm sorry, Marlena. I really am. But they're not wrong about your choices. You've always been different, and that's fine. But different has consequences. Different has consequences. The words echoed in my head as I sat there, surrounded by the 4 people. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body. I looked around the room one more time, at the family photos that would soon be missing my face, at the furniture I'd never sit on again, at the people who'd just collectively decided I was too inconvenient to love. "Well," I said, and my voice sounded remarkably calm. "I guess that's that." I walked to the front door, my hand on the brass knob that I'd turned thousands of times before. Behind me, I could hear my mother starting to say something, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Marlena," Vivian called out, and I paused. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might say this was all a mistake, might choose her sister over her inheritance. "Drive safe," she said instead. I drove back to my studio in a daze, my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. When I finally made it to my apartment, I sat on my couch. The thrift store couch I'd reupholstered myself. In the apartment I'd decorated with my own art and plants I'd grown from cuttings. And I cried, until I had no tears left. Then I got angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes you want to break things or call people names. The cold, calculated anger that makes you want to prove everyone wrong. The kind of anger that becomes fuel. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth it. I'd spent 6 years building a small business while constantly apologizing for not building something bigger. I'd spent my entire adult life feeling like I was falling short of expectations that had been designed to exclude me. But what if I stopped trying to meet their expectations? What if I started exceeding my own? The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I took a sick day from my own business. Instead of opening the studio, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, and I made a plan. I'd been thinking small because they'd taught me to think small. I'd been accepting crumbs because they'd convinced me I wasn't worthy of the whole meal. But what if they were wrong? What if the problem wasn't that I wasn't good enough, but that I'd never given myself permission to be great? My pottery was good. Better than good, actually. My customers told me all the time that my work was special, that they'd never seen anything quite like it. But I'd been too afraid to really listen, too conditioned to minimize my own achievements. What if I stopped minimizing? I spent the day researching. I looked up ceramics artists who'd made it big, who'd built international careers in gallery. Representation. I studied their paths, their timelines, their breakthrough moments. I researched art residencies, grant opportunities, exhibition spaces. I looked into the economics of scaling a creative business, the logistics of shipping nationwide, the requirements for gallery representation. By evening, I had a roadmap. It was ambitious, maybe impossibly so, but it was mine. The first step was obvious. I needed to get my work in front of new eyes. I'd been comfortable in my little Portland bubble, but comfort was a luxury I could no longer afford. I started by reaching out to ceramics artists I admired, asking for advice, for connections, for honest feedback on my work. I was surprised by how generous people were, how willing they were to share knowledge and open doors. It was like I'd been living in a house with all the windows covered, and suddenly I was pulling back the curtains to discover a whole world I'd been missing. Within a month, I had my first gallery showing scheduled, a group exhibition at a small but respected gallery in Seattle. The irony of showing my work in my brother's city wasn't lost on me, but I tried not to think about it. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. The gallery opening was on a Thursday night in May. I drove up to Seattle with my car packed, full of carefully wrapped pieces, my stomach churning with nerves and excitement. I'd never had my work displayed professionally before. Never had strangers examine my art with the kind of serious attention that gallery spaces command. The opening was more successful than I'd dared to hope. 3 pieces sold that first night, and the gallery owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Carmen, pulled me aside to ask if I'd be interested in a solo show in the fall. "Your work has something special," she told me, and I felt something inside me uncurl that had been tightly wound for years. There's an honesty to it, an emotional depth that's rare. You're not trying to be anyone else. You're just being yourself, but with complete commitment. Being yourself with complete commitment. I carried those words with me as I drove back to Portland that night, as I threw myself into preparing for the solo show, as I slowly began to understand that I'd been living my life at half volume for 32 years. The solo show in October was a revelation, not just because it sold out, though it did, but because standing in that gallery, watching strangers connect with work I'd made with my own hands, I finally understood what I'd been missing. I'd been so focused on gaining my family's approval that I'd forgotten to seek my own. But the real turning point came a week after the show closed. I was back in Portland, working in my studio, when Carmen called. She was practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "Marlena, you need to sit down," she said. "I just got off the phone with a collector in New York. She was at your opening, loved your work, and she wants to commission a major piece for her new restaurant. We're talking about a 6-figure commission. 6 figures. For my pottery. For my hobby." The commission was for a series of large-scale installations, ceramic room dividers and planters that would define the space of an upscale restaurant in Manhattan. It was the kind of project I'd dreamed about, but never thought I was ready for. But as I listened to Carmen describe the client's vision, I realized I was more than ready. I'd been ready for years. I just hadn't been brave enough to believe it. Working on the commission pushed me creatively in ways I'd never experienced. The scale was larger than anything I'd attempted. The timeline was aggressive, and the stakes felt impossibly high. But instead of being paralyzed by the pressure, I found myself energized by it. This was what I'd been training for without knowing it. All those years of small projects, of learning my craft, of building my skills one piece at a time. The installation process in New York was surreal, flying across the country to oversee the placement of my art, working with contractors and designers, seeing my vision come to life in a space where hundreds of people would encounter it every day. It felt like stepping into a life I'd never... Carmen had become more than just my gallery representative. She'd become a mentor and a friend. My assistants, Jade and River, were both young artists who brought fresh energy and new perspectives to my work. The other artists in my building had welcomed me into their community, and I discovered the joy of being surrounded by people who understood the creative process, who celebrated each other's successes instead of minimizing them. There was also David. David was a food photographer who'd been hired to document the restaurant installation. We'd worked together during the setup process, and I'd been struck by his quiet professionalism, the way he could capture the essence of a space without disrupting the work happening around him. He asked me to coffee after the installation was complete, and I said yes without the usual anxiety that had plagued my dating life for years. There was something about him that felt easy, uncomplicated in the best possible way. He was building his own creative career, so he understood the challenges and rewards of that path. He was also kind in a way that felt foreign after years of conditional love from my family. "You know what I admire most about your work?" he asked me during one of our early dates as we walked through a Portland art museum together. "What?" "It's honest. You're not trying to impress anyone or prove anything. You're just making beautiful things because you love making beautiful things. That's rarer than you think." I almost cried right there in the museum, because he was wrong and right at the same time. I had been trying to impress people, trying to prove something for my entire life. But somehow, in the process of building my career, I'd learned to let go of that need. I'd learned to trust my own vision, to value my own judgment, to create from a place of joy rather than desperation. The success continued to snowball throughout the year. I moved to a beautiful new studio space in Southeast Portland, a converted warehouse with soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the space with light. I hired a business manager to handle the administrative side of my growing enterprise. I started teaching masterclasses for other ceramicists, sharing the techniques I'd developed over years of experimentation. But perhaps most importantly, I started saying no to projects that didn't excite me. After years of taking any commission that came my way, I could afford to be selective, to choose projects that challenged me creatively rather than just financially. It was a luxury I'd never imagined having, and one that fundamentally changed how I approached my work. I also started saying no to other things. When former acquaintances reached out, suddenly interested in my success story, I was honest about which relationships felt authentic and which felt opportunistic. When magazines wanted to do profiles that focused more on my family estrangement than my artistic journey, I declined. I'd learned the difference between sharing my story and performing my trauma. The 1-year anniversary of the disownment came and went without fanfare. I marked it privately, acknowledging how much had changed, how much I'd grown, how different my life looked from the perspective of success and self-acceptance. That's when my phone rang. It was Vivian, calling from a number I hadn't seen in over a year. Marlena? Her voice was uncertain, tentative in a way I'd never heard before. It's me. It's Vivian. I sat down slowly, my heart rate immediately accelerating. Hi, Vivian. I saw the article about you in Portland Monthly, the one about local artists, making it big. She paused, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I had no idea you were doing so well. The article. I'd forgotten about it, one of dozens of interviews I'd done over the past year. The journalist had been particularly interested in my story of building a successful creative business, and, while I'd been careful not to air family drama publicly, I'd been honest about taking risks and believing in myself despite external skepticism. Things have been going well, I said carefully. The article mentioned you're represented by galleries in Seattle and Los Angeles now, and that you did that installation in New York? Yes. Another pause. I could practically hear her trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation. Marlena, I think maybe we made a mistake. We. As if she'd been an equal participant in the decision-making, rather than someone who'd sat silently while our parents cut me out of their lives. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, she continued when I didn't respond. Especially since things got complicated with Jason. Jason was her tech executive husband, the one with the perfect job and the perfect life plan. What kind of complicated? He's been having an affair. With his assistant. Very original, right? Her laugh was bitter. I found out 6 months ago. We're getting divorced. I felt a stab of sympathy despite everything. Vivian, I'm sorry, that's awful. The thing is, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. I realized I don't have anyone to talk to about it. All my friends are really Jason's friends, or they're other couples who don't want to deal with messy divorce drama. Mom keeps asking me if I've tried harder to work things out, like it's my fault he cheated, and I keep thinking about how you always seemed so sure of yourself, so independent. I used to think that was a weakness, but now I think maybe it was strength. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug of family loyalty warring with, the memory of sitting in that living room, being dismissed and discarded. I miss you, Vivian said quietly. I miss my sister. You could have had your sister, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. You could have had me all along. But you chose the inheritance over me. You chose silence over speaking up for what was right. I know, she whispered. I know. And I'm sorry. I was scared and I was selfish and I made the wrong choice. But maybe it's not too late to make a different choice now. I looked around my studio, at the works in progress, at the photos on my desk from gallery openings and installation projects, at the business cards scattered across my workspace, from people who valued my work, who saw my worth without needing it, explained to them. What exactly are you asking me, Vivian? I'm asking if you'd be willing to see me, to let me apologize properly, to maybe try to rebuild something. The old Marlena would have said yes immediately. The old Marlena would have been so grateful for any crumb of family acceptance that she'd have overlooked the conditions under which it was being offered. I arrived early and chose a table by the window, somewhere I could watch them approach. When they walked in together, I was struck by how different they looked. Marcus seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than he'd always appeared in my memory. Vivian looked tired, older, like the glossy perfection she'd always worn as armor had finally cracked. They sat down across from me, and for a moment, nobody spoke. "You look good," Vivian said finally. "Happy." "I am happy," I said. "We've been talking," Marcus began, "about what happened last year, about the decisions that were made." "You mean the decision to cut me out of the family?" He winced. "Yes, that." "And we think," Vivian continued, "that maybe we were hasty, that maybe we didn't fully understand what you'd built with your business." I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. "What exactly do you understand now that you didn't understand then?" Marcus cleared his throat. "We understand that you've been more successful than any of us realized, that your business is actually quite impressive. Carmen Morrison, your gallery representative, she's very well respected in the art world." Of course he'd researched Carmen. Of course he'd done his due diligence now that my success was undeniable. "So you're saying you made a mistake?" I asked. "We're saying we'd like to revisit some things," Vivian said carefully. "About the estate planning, about family gatherings, about giving us all a chance to start over. Start over, as if the past year of my life could be erased, as if the pain of being discarded could be undone with a simple reset." "Where are Mom and Dad in all this?" I asked. Marcus and Vivian exchanged a look. They're still processing," Marcus said diplomatically. "But they've authorized us to begin these conversations." Authorized, like I was a business deal they were considering investing in. "Here's what I don't understand," I said, leaning forward. "You all made it very clear that my choices were disappointing, that my lifestyle was unacceptable, that I didn't fit into your vision of family success. What's changed? Just the dollar amount I'm earning?" "It's not just about money," Vivian protested, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Isn't it, though? When my business was small, when I was just getting by, you called it a hobby. Now that I'm successful by your standards, suddenly it's worthy of respect. But the work is the same. I'm the same person. The only difference is external validation." Marcus leaned back, his lawyer face slipping slightly. "Maybe that's true. Maybe we were short-sighted." "Short-sighted," I repeated. "That's one way to put it." Vivian reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "Marlena, I know we hurt you. I know we made terrible choices. But we're family. Doesn't that count for something?" I looked at her manicured hand, at the engagement ring she was still wearing despite the divorce proceedings, at the sister who'd chosen convenience over courage. "You know what I've learned this year?" I said. "I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up. It's about supporting each other through the hard times, not just the successful ones. It's about seeing value in someone even when they don't look like what you expected." I stood up, gathering my purse and my keys. I have a family now. People who believed in me when I was nobody special, who celebrated my successes without needing to be convinced they were real, who showed up for me when it mattered. "But we're your real family," Marcus said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "No," I said, and the certainty of it surprised me. "You're the people who raised me. That's not the same thing." I started to walk away, then turned back. "But Vivian, if you ever need someone to talk to about the divorce, about building a life on your own terms, about figuring out who you are when you're not performing for other people's approval, call me. Not because we're sisters, but because I remember what it feels like to have your whole world fall apart, and I know what it takes to build a better one. I left them sitting there and walked out into the Portland afternoon. The sun was shining, and I had a consultation with a new client in an hour, and David was picking me up for dinner later, and my life felt full in a way it never had when I was trying to squeeze myself into spaces that were never designed to hold me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jade, my assistant. The museum wants to schedule a meeting about the installation proposal. Also, there's a writer from Architectural Digest who wants to interview you. Also, River finished the test pieces for the hotel project and they look amazing. I smiled, typing back. Save the museum meeting for tomorrow. Tell AD I'm available next week. And yes, River is incredible. Let's celebrate tonight, drinks after the studio closes. This was my life now. Full of people who saw my work as valuable, who treated my dreams like they mattered, who showed up when they said they would and celebrated successes without jealousy or qualification. 3 months later, my parents called. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of preparing for a major exhibition at a gallery in Los Angeles, and I'd learned to protect my creative energy from emotional disruption. But something made me pick up. Marlena? My mother's voice was smaller than I remembered, uncertain. It's Mom. Hi, Mom. I was hoping we could talk, in person. Would you be willing to come by the house? The house. The scene of the crime, so to speak. I don't think so, I said gently. But I'd be willing to meet you somewhere neutral. We met at a small cafe near my old neighborhood, one I'd never been to before. My mother looked older than I, remembered, more fragile somehow. She ordered tea and spent a long time stirring in honey before she spoke. I've been seeing a therapist, she said finally. Since Vivian's divorce, she suggested I might have some things to work through about my relationships with my children. I waited, not sure where this was going. She asked me to think about my expectations, about the difference between loving someone and controlling them. My mother's voice was quiet, almost inaudible over the cafe's ambient noise. And I realized I don't know how to love someone without trying to shape them into what I think they should be. It was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I was wrong, Marlena. About your work, about your choices, about what makes a life valuable. I was so focused on what success looked like from the outside that I couldn't see what you'd actually built. She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I couldn't see how strong you'd become, how brave you were to follow your own path. Mom, let me finish, she said, holding up her hand. I need to say this. I was wrong to cut you out of our lives. I was wrong to prioritize appearances over relationships. I was wrong to make you feel like you had to earn our love instead of just receiving it. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I felt something inside my chest loosen. A knot I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. But I also felt the hard-won wisdom of the past year and a half, the knowledge that apologies, even genuine ones, don't automatically repair damage. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. And I believe you mean it. But Mom, you didn't just hurt my feelings. You fundamentally changed how I see family, how I understand love, how I trust people. That's not something that gets fixed with an apology. She nodded, tears spilling over now. I know it's not enough. But I was hoping maybe it could be a beginning. A beginning. Not a return to the way things were, but a start toward something new. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe we could start by getting to know each other again. The real you, not the version I was trying to turn you into. Maybe I could come see your studio, understand your work, meet the people who matter to you now. It was a small offer, but it felt genuine in a way her previous attempts at reconciliation hadn't. "I'd be open to that," I said slowly. "But on the condition that this isn't about bringing me back into the family fold. I've built a life I love, surrounded by people who value me as I am. I won't compromise that for anyone, even for you. Wouldn't ask you to," she said, and I thought she might actually mean it. We started small. Coffee once a month, brief phone calls, careful conversations about neutral topics. She did come to my studio, and I watched her face as she saw the scale of what I'd built, the sophistication of my work, the obvious professionalism of my operation. I could see her recalibrating her understanding of who I was, what I'd accomplished. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hands over one of my larger pieces, "and it's clearly a real business. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." Progress was slow and sometimes painful. Old patterns would resurface. Her tendency to offer unsolicited advice, my defensiveness about my choices. But we were both trying, and that felt like something. My father remained more distant, though he'd stopped actively opposing contact between my mother and me. Marcus still felt too much like a lawyer negotiating a settlement, rather than a brother seeking relationship. But Vivian surprised me. She'd started therapy too, and she was working through her own questions about identity and independence. We began meeting for lunch occasionally, and slowly, carefully, we started rebuilding something that felt more honest than what we'd had before. "You know what's funny?" she said during one of our lunches, about 6 months after our first tentative conversation. "I used to think you were selfish for choosing art over stability. But now I realize I was the selfish one. I was so worried about maintaining my position as the good daughter that I threw you under the bus to keep it." It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd gotten from any of my siblings, and it meant more than she probably knew. "I think we were all just trying to survive," I said. "The problem was that we thought there was only room for one or two of us to be successful, so we started competing instead of supporting each other." She nodded thoughtfully. Do you think there's a way back from that? Not back to how things were, but forward to something better?" "Maybe," I said. "But it would have to be based on who we actually are now, not who we used to be or who anyone thinks we should become." The truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted a way back. The life I'd built without them was richer and more fulfilling than anything I'd experienced while trying to earn their approval. My chosen family, Carmen, David, Jade, River, the community of artists and creatives I'd surrounded myself with, they loved me without conditions, celebrated my successes without resentment, and supported me through challenges without making me feel like a burden. But I was learning that forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation, and that healing could happen without restoration. I could acknowledge the pain my family had caused, while also recognizing that they were flawed people, doing their best with limited emotional resources. I could choose compassion without choosing to be vulnerable to them again. The real vindication came 2 years after the disownment, at an event I never could have imagined attending when I was still desperately seeking their approval. I was invited to give a keynote speech at a national conference for creative entrepreneurs. The organizers had heard about my journey from small pottery studio to nationally recognized ceramic artist, and they wanted me to share my story with other artists who were trying to build sustainable creative careers. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of 500 people who were hanging on my every word, I felt a surreal sense of completion. These were my people, artists and makers and dreamers who understood the courage it takes to bet on yourself, who knew the difference between playing it safe and living authentically. I talked about the importance of defining success for yourself rather than accepting other people's definitions. I talked about the power of community, of surrounding yourself with people who see your potential instead of your limitations. I talked about resilience, about turning rejection into fuel, about the difference between proving others wrong and proving yourself right. "The most dangerous thing you can do as a creative person," I said, is to let other people convince you that your dreams are too small, or too impractical, or too risky. Because the truth is, the only real risk is spending your life trying to be someone you're not. The standing ovation was thunderous, but what moved me more were the conversations afterward. Dozens of artists telling me that my story had given them permission to take their own work seriously, to stop apologizing for their choices, to believe in their own worth. That night, I called David from my hotel room in Chicago, buzzing with excitement and exhaustion. "How did it go?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "It was incredible," I said. "I mean, terrifying and incredible, but mostly incredible." "I'm proud of you," he said simply, and those 4 words meant more to me than all the applause in the world. We'd been together for almost 2 years by then, and he'd become more than just a boyfriend. He was a true partner, someone who understood my ambitions and supported them without trying to manage or control them. He'd been there through the late nights of preparing for exhibitions, the stress of major installations, the emotional complexity of rebuilding relationships with my family. He'd celebrated every success and helped me navigate every setback. "I have something to tell you when you get home," he said, and there was something in his tone that made my heart skip. Good something or bad something? Definitely good something. But it can wait until you're back. I flew home the next day with my mind racing through possibilities. When I walked into my apartment, David was waiting with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of champagne. "Okay," I said, setting down my suitcase. "What's the good news?" He grinned, reaching into his jacket pocket. "The good news is that I've been thinking about what you said in your speech, about defining success for yourself instead of accepting other people's definitions." He pulled out a small velvet box, and my breath caught. And I realized that my definition of success isn't about career achievements or financial milestones, he continued, dropping to one knee right there in my living room. It's about building a life with someone who challenges me to be better, who creates beautiful things, who has the courage to be exactly who she is. I started crying before he even opened the box. "Marlena Chen," he said, "will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, a vintage setting with a stone that caught the light, like water, elegant and unique and completely me. But what made the moment perfect wasn't the ring or the proposal or even the fact that he'd said yes to a lifetime together. It was the realization that this was what love was supposed to feel like: supportive, celebrating, affirming, not conditional, or competitive or demanding, but generous and confident and free. "Yes," I said, and then I said it again because once didn't feel like enough. "Yes, absolutely. Completely, yes." We spent the evening making plans and dreaming about the future, about combining his photography studio with my ceramics workspace, about the home we'd build together, about the life we'd create that honored both of our ambitions and dreams. The next morning, I woke up with my hand on David's chest and my ring catching the sunlight streaming through our bedroom window, and I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete contentment. Not the desperate relief of finally being accepted, but the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. I didn't call my family to share the news right away. For the first time in my life, my instinct wasn't to seek their validation or approval. Instead, I called Carmen, who screamed with excitement. I called Jade and River, who immediately started planning an engagement party at the studio. I called my friend Marcus, different Marcus, a sculptor I'd met through the arts community, who offered to help David and me find the perfect venue. When I finally did tell my mother, a week later, her response surprised me. "I'm so happy for you," she said, and her voice was warm in a way I hadn't heard in years. "He sounds like a wonderful man, someone who sees you clearly." "He is," I said. "He really is. Would you like me to help with the wedding? Planning? I know I don't have the right to assume I'd be involved, but if you want help, I'd love to be part of it. I thought about it for a moment, weighing the desire to include her against the need to protect the joy David and I were building together. I'd like that, I said finally. But as a participant, not as someone trying to manage or control the process. This is our wedding, and we're going to do it our way. Of course, she said quickly. Whatever you want, I'd like to be there for you if you'll let me. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Not a return to the old dynamic, but maybe the beginning of something healthier. The wedding planning process became an unexpected test of the relationships I was rebuilding with my family. My mother, true to her word, offered suggestions without demands and supported our choices even when they weren't what she would have picked. Vivian helped with vendor research and was genuinely excited about dress shopping. Even my father, who had remained largely distant through the reconciliation process, offered to walk me down the aisle. I know I haven't been the father you deserved, he said during a rare private conversation, but I'd be honored to be part of your wedding day if you'll have me. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd gotten from him, and while it didn't erase the hurt, it felt like acknowledgement. Marcus remained the most challenging relationship. He seemed unable to move past his role as the family lawyer, always, approaching conversations like negotiations rather than genuine connection. But even he seemed to be trying, in his own limited way. The wedding itself was everything David and I had dreamed of. A small ceremony in the sculpture garden of a local museum, surrounded by the people who truly mattered to us. Carmen officiated. She'd gotten ordained online specifically for our wedding, and Jade and River were my bridesmaids. David's brother was his best man, and the whole celebration felt intimate and authentic and completely ours. My family attended, and their presence felt appropriate. Not central to the day, but not unwelcome either. They were part of my story, part of how I'd become who I was, even if they weren't the most important characters in my current chapter. But the moment that will stay with me forever was during the reception, when Carmen stood up to give a toast. 5 years ago, she said, I met a talented artist who was afraid to take up space, afraid to ask for what she was worth, afraid to believe in her own gifts. Tonight, I'm looking at a woman who has built an extraordinary career, who has chosen love over fear at every turn, who has shown all of us what it looks like to live authentically. She raised her glass, and the whole room followed suit. To Marlena and David, to love that sees clearly, to partnerships that make both people stronger, and to the beautiful life you're building together. As I looked around that room, at David's radiant face, at my chosen family of artists and dreamers, at my biological family trying their best to show up in new ways, I felt the complete circle of my transformation. I'd started this journey as someone desperate for approval, and I'd become someone who approved of herself. I'd started trying to fit into other people's definitions of success, and I'd ended up creating my own. The revenge I'd initially imagined, proving them wrong, making them regret their choices, had transformed into something more powerful, proving myself right, building a life so fulfilling, so authentically mine, that their approval became irrelevant rather than essential. 6 months after the wedding, I received a call that brought the story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. Marlena? It was Marcus, my brother, and his voice had an urgency I'd never heard before. I need to talk to you about something important. We met at the same coffee shop where he and Vivian had first tried to reconcile with me, but this time, he was alone, and he looked more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he said without preamble. About the family meeting, about cutting you out of the inheritance, about all of it. I waited, not sure where this was going. The thing is, he continued, running his hands through his hair, I've been talking to a financial planner about updating my own estate plan, and he asked me about my siblings, about what provisions I was making for family. He looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in my brother's face before. Genuine regret. And I realized that when I die, everything I've built, the partnership, the investments, all of it, it's going to go to my kids. Which is fine. That's what I want. But they're going to inherit wealth that was built, in part, on the decision to exclude you from our family's resources. I frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. What I'm saying is that our parents' decision to cut you out doesn't just affect this generation, it affects the next one too. My kids are going to benefit from resources that should have been shared with you. And that's not the kind of legacy I want to leave. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. I can't fix what our parents did, he said, but I can fix what it means for the future. This is a check for what your share of the inheritance would have been, plus interest, plus an estimate of what it would have grown to by now if it had been invested. I stared at the envelope, not touching it. Marcus, I don't want... It's not about what you want, he interrupted. It's about what's right. You shouldn't have been punished for choosing to live authentically, and my children shouldn't benefit from that punishment. I finally took the envelope, though I didn't open it. Why now? He leaned back in his chair, looking older than his years. Because I'm tired of living with the knowledge that I chose comfort over courage. I sat there and let them cut you out because it was easier than fighting for what was right. I've been a coward, and I don't want to be a coward anymore. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. I don't know if this fixes anything between us, he continued. I don't know if you can forgive me, or if you even should. But I wanted to do the right thing, even if it's too late for it to matter. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw not the golden child who'd always had everything handed to him, but a middle-aged man trying to make sense of the choices he'd made, trying to find a way to live with himself. It's not too late, I said softly. It's never too late to choose courage over comfort. Later that day, I opened the envelope in the privacy of my studio. The amount was staggering. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to transform my business, to buy the building my studio was in, to fund projects I'd only dreamed about. But what moved me more than the money was what it represented. It was acknowledgement. It was Marcus saying that I had belonged all along, that the exclusion had been wrong, that my worth wasn't conditional on their approval. I called David first, then Carmen, then my mother. Each conversation was different, but they all carried the same theme, justice, finally served not through revenge or spite, but through recognition and restoration. With my mother, the conversation was particularly meaningful. Marcus told me what he was planning to do, she said, and it made me realize that financial restitution isn't enough. I owe you more than money. I owe you acknowledgement of how wrong I was, how much damage I caused, how much I missed by not seeing who you really were. Mom, no, let me say this. You built something extraordinary, not just your business, but your whole life. You surrounded yourself with people who see your value. You created work that brings beauty into the world. You found love that honors who you are. You did all of that without our help, despite our obstacles. That's not just impressive. It's heroic, I cried then, sitting in my studio surrounded by my work, finally hearing the words I'd needed but stopped waiting for. The money allowed me to expand in ways I'd never imagined. I bought the building, renovated it into a true ceramics campus with multiple studios, a gallery space, and a residency program for emerging artists. I created the very kind of supportive creative community I'd wished for during those early years of struggle. But perhaps more importantly, I used some of the money to establish a scholarship fund for young artists from families who didn't understand or support their creative ambitions. I called it the Chosen Family Foundation, and its mission was simple: to provide financial support and mentorship for artists who needed to build their own definitions of success. 3 years later, as I stood in the gallery space of my ceramics campus, Surrounded by work from artists I'd supported through the foundation, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The woman who'd sat in her parents' living room and accepted their rejection felt like a character from someone else's story. I'd learned that revenge isn't about making others pay for their mistakes. It's about refusing to let their mistakes define your worth. It's about building something so beautiful, so authentic, so fulfilling that their approval becomes irrelevant. It's about choosing love over fear, community over isolation, growth over resentment. David appeared at my elbow, sliding his arm around my waist as we watched visitors explore the gallery. "Proud of you," he murmured, and I leaned into his warmth. "Proud of us," I corrected, because this life I'd built wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours, created through partnership and mutual support, and the kind of love that makes both people stronger. My phone buzzed with a text from Jade. "The piece for the Denver hotel is ready for shipping. Also, the Times wants to do a feature on the foundation. Also, your 3 p.m. appointment is here." I smiled, typing back quickly before tucking my phone away. This was my life now. Full and complicated and demanding and absolutely mine. I was successful by any measure, but more importantly, I was successful by my own measure. I was surrounded by people who celebrated my achievements, supported my dreams, and loved me without conditions. The best revenge, it turned out, wasn't revenge at all. It was building a life so rich, so authentic, so fully realized that the people who'd tried to diminish me became irrelevant to my happiness. It was discovering that I didn't need to prove them wrong. I only needed to prove myself right. And I had. Every day, in every choice I made to honor my gifts rather than minimize them, to surround myself with people who saw my worth rather than my deficits, to build beauty rather than harbor bitterness, I proved myself right. As I watched, a young artist from my foundation program explained her work to an excited collector, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. This was what success looked like. Not just personal achievement, but the ability to lift others as you climbed, to create ripples of possibility that extended far beyond your own life. I thought of that scared, desperate woman who'd once sat in a family meeting and learned that love wasn't guaranteed, that belonging had to be earned, that her dreams were too small to matter. I wanted to tell her that she was wrong about all of it, that love without conditions was possible, that she already belonged to herself, and that was enough, that her dreams weren't too small but too big for people with small imaginations to understand. But mostly, I wanted to tell her what I'd learned in the years since, that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the gift of being forced to become who you really are, that sometimes rejection is redirection, that sometimes losing your family is the first step toward finding your people, and that the sweetest revenge of all is refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. I hope this story resonates with anyone who's ever felt undervalued by the people who should have seen their worth first. If you've got your own story of finding your chosen family, of building something beautiful despite the doubts of others, or of discovering that your worth isn't determined by other people's approval, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone in these experiences, that there's a whole community of people who understand what it means to bet on yourself when no one else will. What's your story of unexpected support? Who became your chosen family when your given family couldn't see your value? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment, and your stories matter.